Hello and welcome to Figure Model Airbrushing. I'm your host Phil Lister, and I'm going to be showing you how to achieve great results using an airbrush on your next figure model. Airbrushing allows for a more professional, organic look to just about any figure model. Mostly, it's used for obtaining proper flesh tones. There's really no other way when it comes to smooth skin subjects. When a figure has texture, you can dry brush or use washes. For figures that have smooth skin, airbrushing is really the only way to go. Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Airbrushes come in all makes and models. A few of the most popular brands are Badger, Pache, Testors Aztec, and Iwata. All of these brands are quite good, and it really comes down to how much you want to spend and how detailed you want to get. Do your research. Check online. Talk with other model builders, and by all means, check with your local hobby dealer. They can be most helpful in answering any questions that you may have. I use a Badger Anthem Model 155. It's great for fine and medium lines, and it'll spray just about any medium. This is what I'll be using for all the demonstrations on this video. Airbrushes come in what are called external mix and internal mix. Internal mix means that both the air and paint mix inside the airbrush itself and then exit through the nozzle. An external mix airbrush has the paint nozzle below the air nozzle, as with this Pache H3. Generally, this type of airbrush is much easier to clean. The Badger 155 is an internal mix, so both the paint and air mix before exiting the nozzle. It's also known as a double action brush, which allows for on-the-fly control of the paint flow. Inside, there's a needle which runs through the brush, and when the trigger is pulled back, the needle opens the nozzle. This allows more paint to be sprayed. When you release the trigger, the spring inside pushes the needle against the inside of the nozzle, closing off the nozzle, thus stopping the paint flow. This allows for more precise control as you spray. If you've never used an airbrush before, I highly recommend that you practice on sheets of paper or poster board. Spray vertical and horizontal lines. Move the trigger back and forth to see how the spray width changes and the amount of paint varies. It's even a good idea to paint a sphere or a cube to get the hang of using the airbrush. Since airbrushes rely on compressed air to function, you need an air source. The best source is a compressor. If you can avoid it, stay away from canned propellant. The cans are expensive for one, and they tend to lose pressure rather quickly while in the middle of an airbrush session. I use an Iwata Medea Power Jet, which has a small tank. That way, the compressor runs just long enough to pressurize the tank, then it shuts off. It's also considered a silent compressor, so there's no loud noise while it's running. Also, make sure that your compressor has a regulator moisture trap. The regulator allows you to control the air pressure, and the moisture trap keeps condensation from spraying through the airbrush, thus ruining your paint job. Let's go ahead and airbrush a sphere for practice. Begin by cutting a stencil out of some poster board or heavy cardstock. Place the stencil on top of another sheet of poster board. Choose a color, mix up some paint, and begin spraying inside the cutout area. Spray the color in a circular pattern, leaving an area near the top of the circle clear, allowing the surface of the poster board to show through, like a highlight dot. Mix up a darker shade of the circle color and spray that in, somewhere lower, away from the highlight area. Now the circle has become a sphere. Mix up some black and paint a shadow under the sphere freehand. You can create a mask for this if you wish, but it's better to practice this freehand. There, you have now airbrushed a piece of two-dimensional artwork. When it comes to paints, just like airbrushes, there's a wide variety to choose from. In the case of figure kits that are made of polyvinyl, acrylic paints are a must because using enamel or oil-based paints simply don't work. The oil paints actually leach the oils out of the vinyl. When this occurs, the paints will not dry. Acrylic paints are water-based, less toxic, and dry fast. As a matter of fact, I use a blow dryer to speed dry the paint so I can keep right on painting. Testors and Tamiya have complete lines of acrylics available, as do other manufacturers. See your local hobby retailer for all the lines and color varieties. While I do occasionally use Testors and Tamiya paints, my personal preference is Apple Barrel Colors by Plaid. There are craft paints available at many arts and crafts stores like Michael's and AC Moore. Liquitex is another good brand, and you can leave them thick right out of the tube to brush by hand, or you can thin them down for airbrushing. Badger also makes a line of paints specially created for figure models called FreakFlex. They come pre-thinned for airbrushing. The line was actually designed by FX and model artist Tom Gilliland for Badger. Now, I'm going to mix a flesh tone for this Vampirella kit. The model has been cleaned, sanded, and primed with primer. Any good quality primer will do, but I use a brand put out by Walmart. There's Rust-Oleum, Plastic Coat, and Krylon. The less expensive ones will still do the job, but like everything else, everyone has a preference. Coating the model with primer does several things. First, it allows you to see any surface imperfections after you've done any sanding or putty work. Second, it gives the paint something to adhere or bite onto. Gather together all of the tools and materials that you'll need. I use small plastic drinking cups for paint mixing. I also like to use a wide brush for stirring the paint because this really mixes it up well as opposed to using some sort of stir stick. With acrylics, water is a good thinning agent. You can also use an alcohol-based window cleaner or an auto windshield washer. These also work well for cleaning, but we'll cover that in Chapter 5. The colors I use for mixing a flesh tone are white, red, yellow, a dark brown, and orange. I begin by adding some white to a cup. I then add a little bit of red, yellow, and some brown. I then add some water. I like flesh tones somewhat pale, but with a warmer tone, or hue. That's where the orange comes in. Orange adds a warm look to colors, including flesh tones. Since acrylic paints dry rather quickly, I add some folk art paint extender to the mix. This allows for slower drying time and helps keep the airbrush from clogging. To check for proper spraying viscosity, I dip the mixing brush into the paint. I then press it against the inside of the cup and watch it as it runs down the side. If the paint runs too quickly and looks too semi-transparent, it's too thin for spraying. But if it runs down slow and looks more opaque, it's ready to use. Remember to read all of the instructions that came with your airbrush. If you're using a compressor, read all of that documentation as well. With basic spraying, the air pressure should be set between 15 to 25 psi. I keep a stack of 3x5 white index cards handy for test spraying before and even during airbrushing. This allows me to check the spray pattern and to check for any clogging. After adding the paint to the bottle, I attach the airbrush and begin spraying. I continue to airbrush the whole model and coat all of the flesh areas with the base color. Once the base color has been applied, I then speed dry the paint. After this, I spray on some Testors Dull Coat to seal and to protect the work done so far. Painting highlights and shadows on figure models is where learning how to use an airbrush really pays off. This is where you'll add the subtle effects of simulating how light plays on objects. To further demonstrate this, if a pinpoint light source lights this sphere from above, the light striking it creates a highlight on top and a shadow falling underneath. The same thing happens with scale models. Since the scaled down object is being viewed under full-scale lighting in a room, we must simulate the light effect using different shades of color. This chart demonstrates, using flesh colors, the 3 different shades that are used. Both the highlight and the shadow colors are mixed using the midtone color as a base. To create a highlight color, I take some of the midtone that I first mixed up and add some to a cup. I then add some white and a few drops of yellow and stir that up. The yellow keeps the flesh color from looking too pale or pasty. Again, I check for the proper viscosity. Now I start spraying on all the raised areas, all the areas that would be hit by the light source. I spray carefully, slowly building up the color until I have successfully achieved the right look. For the shadow color, again I return to the midtone and add some of that to a cup. I am then going to add some reddish brown to that. I then spray this tone into all of the recessed areas. This is where the shadows would naturally fall. See how this works? Highlights on top, shadows underneath. I want to paint this Countess Karnstein bust so that she has more of an undead vampire look. For that, I'm going to add a bit of grayish blue to the base flesh color. This will make her flesh tones lighter and give her that death-like pallor. Just as I painted the Vampirella, I apply a smooth, even coat all over the flesh areas of the bust. I come back and speed dry that, and then spray on some dull coat to protect the work. I'm going to begin the shadow effect. First, I'll spray a purplish red in and around the recessed areas, keeping the spray a little wider in order to build a little color depth. I want a rather subtle effect here at this point. Next, I take a darker shade of the flesh and a little bit more of the purplish red, and I concentrate that in the shadow areas, tightening up the pattern a little more. Trying to dry brush this would only make it look scruffy and blotchy. If you're really good with washes, that's fine, but washes can take a lot of time, and then you still may not achieve the effect you want. Another effect is the blue and purple tint on certain areas of Robocop's armor. I spray on a mix of Future Floor Wax and water. Future Floor Wax is an excellent gloss coat for models. To begin the tint, I add a small amount of blue paint to the same mix of Future and water. I then airbrush this tint over the areas I want to add the blue color to. Using the same mix of Future and water, I add some purple paint and spray in the areas around the blue tint. You really don't want to apply too much. Remember, less is more. Another airbrush technique is to simulate a sheer clothing effect. This Angelina Sorceress of Light model has what is supposed to be sheer clothing, especially over her breasts. To create this effect, I first airbrush the figure itself. Next, using the same flesh color, I spray some over the clothing. I also paint the nipple areas. I decided on white for her clothing, so I then airbrush those areas near what actually covers her breasts with white. I allow some overspray to mix with the flesh areas, and I even purposely mist over top, thus creating a subtle sheer effect. When the parts are attached, it gives the illusion that those areas are covered in a sheer cloth. I'm going to disassemble and clean two different make and model airbrushes to show how to clean them thoroughly. One of the brushes will be the Badger Anthem, which is like most any other internal mix double action airbrush, and the second will be a Pache H3 single action external mix. I'll start with the Badger Anthem. I begin by removing the back portion of the handle. I then slide the needle out. Next, I unscrew the tube shank, which contains the needle tube and spring. The trigger and the guide must be removed as well and replaced before the needle is put back in. I then unscrew the outermost nozzle and then the secondary nozzle. The actual cone-shaped nozzle is removable as well. Using some alcohol-based window cleaner and a pipe cleaner, I remount the airbrush body at both ends. Using some cotton wrapped around a toothpick, I clean out the inner nozzle. This opening is too small for a standard cotton swab or pipe cleaner. I then use a cotton swab soaked in cleaner on the needle itself and then wipe that off with a paper towel. I then go ahead and reassemble the airbrush. I'm careful not to push the needle too hard against the nozzle. That's what causes the nozzle to flange or split open. Now, for the paché, I begin by removing the cone assembly from the brush. This is really the only section that needs thorough cleaning. There's a tiny set screw underneath, which must be removed first. Using a cotton swab and pipe cleaner, I remount the cone and nozzle. I also wipe the opening to clean that area as well. I then reassemble the brush, and as with the Anthem, I spray some cleaner through it to make sure the whole brush is clean and ready to use. I can't stress enough how important it is that your airbrush be clean. By keeping your airbrush clean, you'll help to avoid many of the problems that may occur, and you'll have years of trouble-free use. Well, that does it for this video. I hope that you gained some valuable information that you can use the next time you go to paint a figure model. Until next time, this is Phil Lister saying, go paint a figure model.